in pre-colonial Myanmar and Britain. The political function of ethnicity in the pre-modern world is a topic of some debate and uncertainty. By what criteria should we periodize political community across Eurasia? To what extent did 18th-century nationalism constitute a radical innovation, and to what extent a mere variation on established patterns? I address these issues by deploying the term political ethnicity to describe what I argue were generally similar concepts of community in restricted sectors of Asia. Political ethnicity I define as a complex of traits specific to a named population whose distinctiveness was recognized by group members and outsiders alike. To focus a potentially overbroad discussion, I use Myanmar, formerly Burma, and England-Britain as case studies. Ethnic features became political when one or more elements were used to identify leaders and followers as members of a state-centered collectivity. Political ethnicity in pre-colonial Myanmar, pre-modern Britain, and other countries located around what I term the Eurasian Rimlands, a term to be discussed shortly. Ethnic claims to preeminence often invoked superior commitment to doctrinal truth. Systematically promoted in schools and state institutions, patriotism acquired a quasi-permanent public character. But expressions of political ethnicity galvanized by external threats and reliant on personal or religious networks tended to be far more episodic and short-lived. From the medieval era to the 19th century, we find evolving but recognizable continuities in regnal self-image and ethnic symbolism. Nationalism was unprecedentedly ambitious, systematic, and discursively intolerant. In this perspective, it also can be seen as a hypertrophic elaboration and logical extension of political ethnicity. In these ways, gradually or fitfully, consciously or unconsciously, overarching ethnic norms penetrated encapsulated local cultures. Between ca. 1100 and 1850, Eurasian climate and expanding long-distance trade ensured that cycles of economic expansion and retardation, state strengthening and temporary collapse, and cultural integration correlated remarkably well in Southeast Asia and Western Europe. In that vast exposed zone of Eurasia subject to Turkic, Mongol, or Manchu occupation, political ethnicity such as we find in Myanmar and Britain was impossible. Open terrain and inner Asian military strength favored the incorporation into a single empire of extraordinarily diverse and far-flung cultures. Inner Asian elites themselves did not share ethnicity with their subjects. Between 1500 and 1850, the core ethnicity grew more dominant, uniform, and politically salient. Ethnicity normally remained subordinate to, or camouflaged by, religious systems, and royal clienteles often remained multi-ethnic. This was true not only in Asia, but in most of Western Europe until the 17th or 18th centuries. In Western Europe after ca. 1700, incomparably rapid economic growth, symptom and cause of Europe's unfolding global commercial hegemony, promoted nationalism. In degree if not in kind, these changes had no parallel in the Asian Rimlands, or indeed in Asia at large. Documenting these claims requires a book-length study, and the present essay attempts merely a preliminary overview. Pagan was the first polity to control extensive sectors of Western mainland Southeast Asia. The empire was deeply segmented administratively, socially, and ethnically. Direct royal authority was confined to the capital region, the chief rice-growing area, while major centers elsewhere in the basin were entrusted to royal relatives. The Irrawaddy lowlands and the vast highland interior were home to a great variety of non-Burmese languages and cultures. Even in Upper Myanmar, bondsmen, many of them deportees, bore diverse ethnic labels. Among long-settled Burmese speakers themselves, inter-village and inter-regional differences in dialect and custom were substantial. Literacy, even in capital circles, was far from universal, but it was certainly more widespread than among the general population. Elite culture was probably more self-consciously Burmese, and it was more expressly Buddhist. Pagan monks composed texts on Pali grammar and Buddhist philosophy. At first Pali, the language of scriptures, and Mon provided the chief literary languages. In the early 1100s, Burmese writing began to develop, and within a century it had become the standard vehicle for religious inscriptions and possibly various secular materials. At the same time, as noted, Burmese colonization spread Burmese dialects and customs west beyond the original zone of settlement. Unlike their post-pagan successors, pagan rulers, so far as we know, did not identify themselves as kings of the Burmese. Courtiers and monks saw themselves inhabiting a supra-ethnic universe, a Buddhist ecumene, embracing Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and northern Thailand. During the so-called medieval climate anomaly, ca. 950-1300, dramatically stronger monsoons improved rainfall in the north, while inundating the coast. Upper Myanmar suffered droughts far more serious than those in areas to the south. Lower Myanmar in this period profited as well from a long-term increase in maritime trade. Thai-speaking Shans launched devastating raids into Upper Myanmar from the Great Belt of highlands north and northeast of the basin. Various Shan principalities enjoyed the same two advantages as their coastal counterparts: privileged access to firearms and to burgeoning long-distance trade. Chinese military contacts and the exchange of Shan area gems for Chinese silver proved critical. The Shan, Mon, and Burmese worlds were far too politically and culturally fragmented to support a stable, overarching ethnic loyalty. Upland geography condemned the Shans to permanent balkanization. Most armies and courts were to some degree polyethnic, as sanctioned by a pan-ethnic aristocratic culture as well as by Buddhism. Bilingualism seems to have been common, and defections to serve rulers of different ethnicity bore no particular stigma. Feasts attended by monks, at which spirits were propitiated, cattle slaughtered, and alcohol consumed, point to the survival of pre-Buddhist traditions. In the Shan Hills, Buddhism had a yet more nominal presence. Pagan faced no regional rival, so there was no military spur to ethnic expression. But decades of bitter north-south warfare lent ethnicity a novel prominence. Chronicles and inscriptions suggest that Burmese, Mon, and Shan leaders in this period commonly referred to their foes in ethnic terms. In large measure, communal tensions grew from north-south population movements. Shan incursions into the northern lowlands offered one dramatic illustration. The most demographically significant long-term shift was the migration between ca. 1350 and 1550 of Burmese settlers into coastal cities. Burmese migration responded to climatic shifts and Shan pressures, but it also benefited from Burmese water control techniques superior to Mon practices. Rising international trade joined agrarian innovation to strengthen market linkages from Yunnan to the south coast. In return for gems and cotton, southwest China supplied the Shan uplands with silver. Shans in turn sent Chinese silver, local tea, and gems into the valley in exchange for salt and Indian textiles. The lowlands then funneled Chinese and Shan goods, along with local produce, to the coast, which imported Indian textiles. Each sector profited from this multi-stage assemblage, but as we shall see, the Burmese-led polity of Taungoo, on the southern fringe of the dry zone, became the chief beneficiary. The 14th to early 16th centuries saw new vernacular poetic genres, the first extant didactic text for students, and the first brief history of Myanmar. Often at the invitation of rival rulers eager to enhance their reputation for piety, Sinhalese-oriented monks spread rituals and learning from coastal ports to inland centers. Between 1300 and 1550 the western mainland saw trends that adumbrated a more durable reintegration under Burmese hegemony. Religious practices throughout the region became more Theravadin and more supportive of royal authority. As lowland-upland market ties thickened, Shans, their ruling elites, entered more closely into the economic and cultural life of the valley. In 1539 Taungoo ruler Tabenshwe Hti R. 1531-1550 overwhelmed Aremania with its commercial wealth. He promptly moved his capital to Pegu, on the coast, where it would remain until the century's end. His more celebrated successor Bayan Nong R. 1551-1581 went on to conquer Ava, the Shan Hills, Chiang Mai, and the Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya. Ethnicity at the first Taungoo court was genuinely mixed. Tabenshwe Hti showed his affinity for the culture of his new home by taking a Mon princess as his chief queen. His territorial vision, excluding much of the Burmese country in favor of an east-west coastal empire, showed no ethnic inspiration. Some Mons resented the large-scale entry of Burmese officials, soldiers, and traders. A branch of the fallen house, based in Upper Myanmar, restored the empire in the early 17th century. The empire disintegrated in the 1590s through military overextension in Siam and uncontrolled autonomy. The restored Taungoo dynasty abandoned claims to Siam in favor of a more compact realm along the Irrawaddy axis. They reduced the danger of provincial rebellion by replacing princely heads with governors of more humble rank. And they shifted the capital itself from Pegu to the Burmese country, where it would remain until the British conquest. 1629-1648 took care to inscribe dedications for his chief religious donation in the three chief languages of the empire, Burmese, Mon, and Yun Thai. The move to Ava reduced royal patronage of non-Burmese clients. In the late 1500s, Mons in the Delta were said to have been as numerous as the hairs on a bullock. From 1740 to 1757 these tensions exploded in a major revolt at Pegu, a regional expression of political ethnicity. The rebels massacred large numbers of Burmese and demanded that the new southern court cut their hair in Mon fashion. In the event, however, Pegu's 1752 conquest of Upper Myanmar sparked a vengeful, ultimately victorious countermovement. While welcoming individual Mon clients, the new strongmen did not hesitate to invoke anti-Mon stereotypes and to kill Mon prisoners, while sparing Burmese. Although some clienteles in both North and South remained polyethnic, Burmese quickly became a shorthand for pro-Northern, and Mon for pro-Southern, allegiance. From 1752 to 1830, under early Konbong rule, three long-standing trends became unprecedentedly salient. Burmese culture in the lowlands grew more uniform vertically and horizontally, and was increasingly influenced by canonical Buddhism. Konbong leaders were more successful than their immediate Taungoo predecessors in concentrating manpower. Rising foreign demand from ca. 1680 to 1830 stimulated the cotton, teak, and shipbuilding sectors. Imported textiles, along with New World silver, drew peasants to the market. Between 1635 and 1802 both the overall population and the number of local markets rose 30 to 50%. The population of key provincial market towns increased by 50 to 100%. Written contracts that cates multiplied rapidly. By 1780 land sales, once conducted in a mix of cash and in-kind goods, were almost exclusively in cash, and taxes were substantially monetized. Economic growth strengthened the state, hence its ability to advance Burmese and Buddhist norms directly and indirectly. Literacy aided the collection and dissemination of information. Religious education in the villages promoted reverence for the ruler as moral exemplar. Most fundamentally, increases in population, foreign trade, and imported guns joined administrative reform to boost the throne's military capacity and ambition. In Upper Myanmar, the formation of ethnically disparate military service Almadan units underscored the court's distinctly pre-nationalist ethos. Monks and laymen joined to disseminate texts, to strengthen monastic standards, and to repress alcohol and opium use. Konbong kings abandoned pre-Buddhist origin myths to claim descent from Gautama Buddha. In 1550 the imperial court had been genuinely polyethnic, but by 1770 Burmese completely dominated the court. In southern Myanmar, following Alongpaya's reconquest, separatist and assimilationist responses continued. Both responses led ultimately only in one direction, more complete Burmanization. Across the great Thai-speaking uplands, Burmese influence, Buddhism in particular, also advanced, albeit at more elite levels. As in the Taungoo era, the key mechanisms were movements of monks and traders. Through such channels Taishan scripts, calendars, measurements, architecture, and Buddhist practices increasingly followed Burmese models. Britain and Myanmar may seem like an odd pairing, given that by 1820 Britain was en route to becoming the first industrial nation. Myanmar was agrarian, relatively poor, and about to become a British colony. In both realms, which in 1400 were of like size and population, an economically privileged court expanded its authority. During the same period ca. 900-1300 as Burmese-led Pagan established a novel dominion over parts of the western mainland, southeastern England developed a cultural template that would transform the British archipelago. On the eve of the Norman conquest, Anglo-Saxon literati portrayed the Rex Anglorum as ruler of a distinctive people. Not long after Pagan-era colonists moved west of the Irrawaddy, Anglo-Norman, that is to say English, expanded in Wales and Ireland. In brief, although cultural integration by 1300 was more pronounced in Britain than in Myanmar, in both realms the core imperial culture enjoyed a novel extension. Local resistance to Anglicization notwithstanding, similar motifs gradually modified rural and urban life in much of Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. Partly to forestall foreign interventions, an ever more powerful London-centered state brought all three of these regions into its political orbit between 1535 and 1801. The shift from prosperity ca. 900-1300 to depression ca. 1300-1450-1500 reflected, above all, a hemisphere-wide change from the agriculturally beneficent medieval climate anomaly to the Little Ice Age. Thereafter, climate continued to influence output, but from 1500 to 1800 the diminished amplitude of climate fluctuations and the rising volume and complexity of global trade meant that coordination between Britain and Myanmar reflected chiefly the synchronizing impact of Japanese and American bullion flows. Growth rates in southeast England and the Irrawaddy Basin, both of which combined privileged access to maritime trade with agricultural superiority, normally exceeded those in outer areas. Intertwined with quantitative expansion were structural transformations in both economies, as monetization became universal and regional autarky receded. As in Myanmar, culture tended to follow economic change. In Myanmar we saw a similar link between commerce, religious reform, and vernacular education. As Britain's chief port, government and financial center, home to the printing industry, and hub of a growing road network, London by the late 17th century had become a cultural arbiter whose styles radiated across the archipelago. As in Myanmar, the relation between economic and cultural integration, on the one hand, and state strengthening was synergistic. Particularly from the mid-1600s, Atlantic trade joined domestic economic vitality to swell the state's resource base. Monetization and literacy aided tax collections, while, as just noted, cultural standardization favored identification with the imperial center. During 16th-century struggles with Spain and the epic Anglo-French contests of 1689–1815, which overlapped with large-scale Burmese-Siamese warfare. Contrasts between Protestant truth and Catholic superstition, servitude, and poverty helped English, Welsh, and Scots forge their new British persona. Growing exposure to non-European peoples also nurtured a sense of otherness. Social inequality, sanctioned by God karma, was inherently moral because without hierarchy, social order was inconceivable. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 attempted to resolve this contradiction by redefining the polity as a balanced union of royal and parliamentary power. Subsequently, the balance shifted by widening the electorate and by further strengthening the authority of the legislature. The emergence in the 18th century of a system of parliamentary politics laid the foundation for a tradition of party government. In 1830 neither England or Britain was yet a democracy, but they were headed in that direction. In short, by 1830 some basic features that England had shared with Myanmar in 1600, exclusive royal sovereignty, rigid hierarchy, popular passivity, had been modified or rejected. England and Britain both embodied recognizable, if peculiar, versions of nationalism. In part, surely, because of distinctive cultural and legal traditions. I suspect that notions of ancestral lineage and blood ties provided a stronger basis for collective identities among Anglo-Saxons and Anglo-Normans than among pre-1300 Burmese. The authority of English and Scottish kings rested in part on that basis, and despite the Norman conquest, it is unlikely that those traditions lost their popular resonance. By the 17th century the principle was well established that the king was merely the custodian of the common law, the accumulation of precedents based on collective reason and experience. The first king of the world traditionally was said to have copied Burmese laws from the boundary wall of the universe. While kings were expected to conform to Buddhist morality, apart from very occasional expressions of monastic disapproval, there was no enforcement mechanism. Nor, although disputants had the option of seeking private arbitration, were rulings by royally appointed judges in the countryside subject to regular review. The papal revolution of the 11th to 13th centuries induced each Christian ruler to identify more closely with a named territory and people. Catholic kingdoms diverged from Theravada Buddhistas as well as Orthodox Christian, Confucian, and Muslim polities. By formally and irrevocably fragmenting Christendom, the Protestant Reformation reinforced English and British individuality. The Reformation had the unintended effect of encouraging a degree of tolerance. Many in England, Scotland, and Wales came to embrace the state as an instrument less of confessional uniformity than of domestic peace. The Church of England found itself forced to cohabit with dissenters and Catholic recusants. At the same time, by promoting private Bible study, which had the effect of universalizing the clergy, the Reformation joined literacy and rising consumerism to encourage individual agency, which reinforced the transition from subjecthood to citizenship. In parts of Britain a distinct legal heritage, an early fusion of political and secular culture, and Christian fragmentation joined to nourish national, proto-democratic orientations. By 1500 Burmese urbanization, commercial integration, and monetized exchange already were less developed than Britain's. As Britain came to dominate the vast Atlantic system and as British agriculture, manufacturing, and marketing underwent major structural change, disparities became ever more cumulative. As well as any factor, economic intensification and colonial rivalries explain the strength of English and British nationalism. From 1680 to 1815 the British state's share of national income rose from some 4% to 20%. Along with the growth of the economy itself, this nurtured a vast increase in government personnel. And because Parliament had to approve taxes, the Crown's chronic need for military finance in the 17th and 18th centuries contributed directly to parliamentary supremacy. Myanmar offers parallels to many of these developments, but always less sustained and intense. If the British government in 1815 obtained 20% of national GDP, its Burmese counterpart probably never secured 10%. Opportunities for government expansion and administrative routinization were correspondingly limited. In Myanmar after 1760 the Konbaung dynasty succeeded in strengthening hereditary service categories. Whereas in Britain subjects became citizens, in Myanmar sovereignty remained exclusively royal. In the 1830s to 1850s spokesmen for the industrial working class broadened this approach to demand universal male suffrage and parliamentary reform. Political equality, not inequality, now was becoming inherently moral. I find no aspiring Burmese social groups eager to expand their influence. The consistent ambition of courtiers, literati, and commoners alike was to find a patron whose authority derived from the throne. The traditional religious concern to obtain salvation by accumulating good karma only intensified this orientation. In Britain, unlike Myanmar, popular patriotism nationalism filled much of the space opened by the demands of commerce, the retreat of aristocratic privilege, and the evolution of religion. Popular loyalty focused on Parliament and the monarchy as guarantors of overseas empire and domestic prosperity. To paraphrase Brad Gregory, Britons decided to eschew theology in order to go shopping. Much of early modern Eurasia may be conceived as consisting of three political zones. A zone ruled by inner Asian conquest elites, a protected zone, and the zone of modern nationalism. A shared lineage in the latter two zones produced common features, most notably polity-defining ethnonyms, vertical ethnic unity deployed against rival polities. In Western Europe and Rimland Asia each major state came to identify with a named ethnicity. Using Myanmar and pre-1750 England-Britain as case studies, this essay reconstructs these centuries-long similarities in process and form. This essay both strengthens and weakens claims for European exceptionalism. China defies the link between political ethnicity and geographic compactness. Russia, however, is less of an exception to the link. Russia's population was of the same magnitude as that of West European kingdoms, and was heavily concentrated in a relatively small southwestern sector of the empire. See my Embracing the World, Hating Your Neighbors, Ethnicity and Loyalty in Europe and Asia c. 14001850 Cambridge, Massachusetts, forthcoming. In the late 1700s, success of provincial monasticism joined Sangha reforms to open royal monasteries at the capital to infiltration from the villages. This produced still more effective capital-provincial integration, but in the long run reduced the prestige of provincial establishments. A secondary, economically linked spur to ethnic otherness may have been increasing contact with foreign traders. Lammerts, Buddhist law, ch. 5. Lammerts are a form of prayer that is said to have a positive effect on the mind. Lammers are believed to have the same effect on spirits as they have on the body. The Buddhist law is based on the law of the Amazons.